The door was not a door. It was a slab of packed snow that the men had to cut through with a saw meant for whalebone, and when it finally gave way, it did not swing, it fell inward, flat, onto a floor that had not been walked on in no one yet knew how many months. The four of them stood at the threshold with their lamps held low, breathing the stale metal cold that came rolling out to meet them, and for a long moment none of them went in. The light did not travel far. It caught the near edge of a wooden bench, a row of glass jars gone milk-white with frost, a coil of rubber hose stiff as iron. And then, at the far wall, it caught something that made the man in front lower his lamp instead of raising it, as if he did not quite want to see the whole of it at once. There was a tank against the back wall, taller than a man, wider than the span of two, its frame bolted to timbers that had been sunk directly into the ice of the island itself, and the tank was not frozen. That was the first wrong thing, the thing that the survivor would repeat later in the few words he ever gave. The whole world outside that room was locked in ice hard enough to blunt a steel blade, and inside the glass the liquid moved. It moved slowly, the way heavy brine moves, thick and unhurried, and it caught the lamplight and threw it back in a dull amber that should not have existed in a building abandoned to an Antarctic winter. Something was keeping it warm. Nothing in that room was burning. Nothing had burned in a long time. And inside the brine, coiled around itself the way a rope is coiled to be stowed, was the thing they had come too far to unsee. Let me describe it the way the notebooks describe it, slowly, because the men who wrote those pages were not writing to frighten anyone. They were writing to be believed. It was long. Coiled as it was, they could not measure it, but uncoiled they guessed it would run the length of a sledge and half again. Call it 15-16 feet of body, though body is a poor word for it. It was translucent, not clear like glass, but clouded like the flesh of certain deep animals, so that the lamplight passed a little way into it and revealed a faint interior architecture, a suggestion of channels and chambers, a pale internal machinery you could almost read and never quite resolve. The surface was segmented. Ring after ring after ring, each one slightly overlapping the last, ribbed and fluted with a precision that one of the men, a man who had studied under a microscope in another life, set down in ink as being like a diatom. Like the silica shell of a single-celled thing, he wrote, but grown to the size of a sea serpent, as though something microscopic had been permitted to keep growing and had simply never stopped. But diatoms have no limbs. This had limbs. They came off the body at irregular intervals, and they were not fins, and they were not legs, and they were not the arms of any squid hauled up in any net in any ocean the men had sailed. They were jointed, thin, translucent, folded against the flanks the way an insect folds its limbs in the cold, and there were too many of them, and they did not pair the way the limbs of honest animals pair. One of the men counted them and wrote a number and then crossed it out, because the coil made the count impossible and because, he admitted on the page, he did not trust himself to look long enough to be sure. Nobody wanted to look long. That is the thing that comes through the notebooks even before anything happens, even in these first hours, an instinct, shared without discussion, that to hold your eyes on it was a mistake, because the thing was intact. That was the second wrong thing, and it was worse than the warmth. Something suspended in liquid, dead, for months, in a sealed shed at the bottom of the world, should have come apart. It should have sloughed, clouded the brine, sunk into itself. This had not. It hung whole and perfect and articulated, every ring in its place, every folded limb held just so, as if it had been set down mid-motion an hour ago and had simply chosen to stay that way. It looked, the field notebook says, in the small, careful hand of a man trying not to overstate, less like a preserved specimen than like a photograph of a living animal that had agreed to be still. And then, while they stood there, it pulsed. Not violently, nothing so honest as movement. It was the faintest thing, a slow travelling flush that passed down the length of the coiled body, ring to ring to ring, a dimming and a brightening of that internal pale, the way a jellyfish lights and unlights itself far down in black water. Once. Then, after a space long enough that a man could persuade himself he had imagined it again. The brine trembled with it, the smallest ring of ripple crossing the surface and dying against the glass. And the four of them, veterans of ice and drowning and the deaths of friends, men who had chosen the hardest place on earth and come to it on purpose, stood in the doorway of that buried room and did not speak, because there was nothing in the whole apparatus of their language that would let one of them turn to another and say what they were all now certain of. The thing in the tank was not dead. And it had been waiting, in the dark, in the warm, in the coil of its own impossible body, for a light to come. I have spent a long time with the record of this room, longer than I meant to, and I want to be precise with you from the very first minute, because everything about this case rewards precision and punishes the lazy version of it. So hold on to exactly this much and no more. 4 men, a sledging party, cutting into a structure on Rothschild Island in the austral autumn of 1908, a structure that, by every registry I can find, should not have been there, built by an expedition that, by every registry I can find, never sailed, a tank of brine that stayed liquid without fire, a body inside it too large and too whole and too finely made to belong to any animal then catalogued or catalogued since, and a slow, faint, patient light moving through it, ring to ring, while men who did not frighten easily stood frozen in a doorway. They had not yet found the notebooks. They had not yet read the 11 days. They did not yet know what the men who built this room had done to the thing in the glass, or what it had begun, very quietly, to do back. The lamp was low on oil, and one of them, the youngest, thought to raise the wick, and when the flame stretched, the light climbed the tank glass and reached the whole of it at once. And this is where I must slow down, because this is the moment the record itself slows down, the moment the men stopped being a sledging party and became witnesses. It was long. That was the first fact any of them could hold. Coiled as it was, doubled and folded back through the brine like rope stowed by a careful hand, it still filled the tank from floor to the height of a standing man. And if you tried to reckon it unwound, to imagine it drawn out straight, you arrived at a number no one wanted to say aloud, 12 feet, perhaps more, of a single unbroken body with no seam where it might have been joined from smaller parts. And it was segmented, ringed along its whole length in fine, even bands, so evenly that the first instinct was to call it a worm, an enormous ribbon of a worm, the kind that curls in tide pools and comes apart in your fingers. But a worm is a simple thing, and this was not simple. Each of those rings was scored across with a structure so delicate and so regular that the man who later drew it, and one of them did draw it, in pencil in the notebook that survived, kept lifting his hand because he could not believe the geometry was real. Ribbed, he wrote, ribbed like a diatom under the glass. He had been a whaler's naturalist once, this man, and he knew his microscope, and he knew that the sea's smallest architecture, the silica shells of the plankton, are patterned with a precision that looks manufactured, looks impossible, looks designed, and he was telling you, in the only language he had, that this creature, the length of a whaleboat, was built to the tolerances of something you need a lens to see. And then the limbs. This is where the easy words fail entirely, and I want you to sit inside that failure with the men who stood there, because their failure to name it is the truest thing in the whole account. A worm has no limbs. A diatom has no limbs. This had them paired along the underside of certain of the rings, not everywhere but at intervals, folded flat against the body the way a swimming thing folds itself to slide, and they were not fins, and they were not legs, and they were not the arms of an octopus or the fringed feet of anything that walks the deep floor. They were jointed, that is the word in the notebook, underlined once, jointed and translucent, so that in the raised lamplight you could see through them to the rings beneath, and inside each of them ran a thread of that same pale luminescence, so that when the light moved through the body, it moved out into the limbs too, ring to limb to ring, in a slow procession that had no reason to be there and no explanation and no rest. They stood in that for a while. The record does not say how long, and I have stopped pretending I can guess. Then they did what men do when the mind cannot hold a thing. They turned to the room instead, because a room can be searched and catalogued and made ordinary, and a body pulsing in brine cannot. And it was in the searching of the room that they found the notebooks, 3 of them, oilcloth bound, stacked on a plank shelf bolted to the ice wall, dry, legible, waiting exactly as the thing had been waiting. And this is the part I need you to receive slowly, because it is the hinge of everything that follows. The notebooks were written in a working hand, a scientist's hand, dated across the summer of that same year and the one before it, and they described this creature not as a discovery to be published, but as a subject already under study, cared for, measured, fed, watched. The men who built this room had not stumbled on the thing the way our 4 had. They had made it their occupation, and the ink itself is the second impossible fact of this case, sitting beside the impossible body, refusing to be separated from it. Because I have traced these dates and these names against every expedition registry, every Polar Society roll, every ship's manifest and insurance record and port clearance for the whole of that decade, and I will tell you plainly what I found, which is nothing. No vessel logged for Rothschild Island in those seasons. No party of that name returned or reported. No funding society claims them. No university mourns them. No widow's petition. No memorial plaque. No line in the long and careful histories that account for nearly every soul who went south in those years and did not come back. An expedition thorough enough to build a laboratory in the ice and keep 3 volumes of daily observation, and not one registry on Earth admits it sailed. But the notebooks admit it, and they tell you how the thing came to be in the tank. It was cut, they wrote, from deep shelf ice. Not scraped from the surface, not netted from open water. Cut, quarried, dug out from far down inside the shelf where the ice is old enough to be black, where it has held whatever it holds since before there were men to wonder about it. They brought it up in a block, still frozen, still folded in its coil, and the earliest entries describe it as a specimen, a fossil, a beautifully preserved dead thing, and their excitement is the clean, ordinary excitement of naturalists who believe they have found a wonder they can name and own. They set the block in the brine to thaw it slowly, to keep the fine structure from cracking as the ice let go. And on the 3rd day of thawing, the thing moved. I have read that entry more times than I can count, and it never loses its weight, because of how it is written, not in terror, not yet, but in the careful denial of a trained mind refusing its own eyes. A settling of the specimen as the ice released it, the writer said. A shifting of mass, nothing more. But the next day there is another movement, and the day after that, and by the entry they marked as the 5th day the denial is gone and something colder has replaced it, because they had stopped calling it the specimen and started calling it the animal, and they had noticed the thing that our 4 men in the doorway had not yet lived long enough to notice. It turned, slowly, over hours, so slowly you could not catch it in the act, but leave the room and come back, and it had turned to face the place where a man had been standing. And when they tested this, when they set one man to watch it and sent the others out, the body came around, ring by ring, limb by folded limb, until the blind ringed head of it, if it was a head, they never decided, was oriented on the watcher. It thawed alive for 11 days. And across those 11 days the notebooks record, in a hand that grows smaller and more careful with each entry, that whatever the thing was using to know they were there, it did not use it on all of them equally. It turned toward whichever man watched it longest. It sought the attention that sought it. And the last of the 3 men to understand this, the naturalist, the one who drew it, the one who knew his diatoms, wrote a single line on the 11th day that our 4 sledgers read by lamplight in that sealed room, And it is the line that made them stop searching and stand very still and begin, at last, to be afraid in the right way. He had written, "It prefers to be seen. It prefers to be seen." Read that line the way the four men in the doorway read it, 40 years too late to warn anyone, and you understand why the notebook that follows those words changes character entirely. The naturalist's careful hand does not steady after the 11th day. It fractures. The entries stop being observations of a specimen and become the private log of a man who has realized he is no longer the only party in the room capable of taking notice. There is a gap of 2 pages, torn out at the spine, the stubs still there, the paper gone. And when the record resumes, it is in a different pen, a heavier ink, and the first thing this new hand records is the temperature of the brine. It was rising. They had kept the tank in the coldest chamber of the buried structure precisely because the thawing had to be controlled, because the ice they had cut it from lay hundreds of feet down where the shelf pressed the water to a cold that does not exist at the surface, and they had reasoned sensibly that warmth would rot it. So they logged the brine every few hours against a mercury thermometer lashed to the tank frame, and the numbers, transcribed in that later hand, climb, not toward the temperature of the room, past it. The chamber around the tank held near to freezing, as it had all along, the men's own breath fogging in the lamplight, and inside the glass the fluid grew warm, then warmer, a full 19 degrees above the air that surrounded it, warming from within, warming around the coiled, translucent body, as though the body itself were the source. There is no mechanism for this in any account of preservation I have ever read. A dead thing does not heat the medium that holds it. A dead thing surrenders its cold to the room. This did the opposite, and the man writing it down knew it did the opposite, because beside the last temperature he recorded, he wrote no interpretation at all. He simply drew a small line under the number and did not write again in that column. The next symptom is the one the sledging party could still see with their own eyes when they entered, 4 decades on, and it is the detail that I cannot make ordinary no matter how long I sit with it. The glass had fogged from the inside. Not from their breath. The breath of living men fogs the outer surface of cold glass, and that condensation had long since gone to frost and fallen. This was interior. A film of moisture on the inner wall of a sealed tank, on the surface that touched only the brine, as though something within had been breathing against it, close, patient, from the side where nothing living was supposed to remain. And in that fog, the last observer recorded, there were marks. He does not call them anything. He describes only that the fog on the inner glass was disturbed in places, in a pattern, low down, at the level where a man kneeling to look in would put his face, as though it had been watching them look from the other side and had leaned toward the watching. Then comes the night. It is compressed into a handful of lines, and the compression is itself the horror, because a man who has filled pages with the shape of a limb and the color of a ring now has almost nothing to say about the single most important event of the entire expedition. He writes that the brine was warm to the touch through the glass. He writes that the lamps guttered, though the stove was full. He writes that Harmon, a name, at last, a name the registries do not carry, one of the 3, stood at the tank for the length of a watch, and then walked to the outer door and worked the seal, and went out onto the ice without his coat, and that when 2 of the others went after him, they did not come back either, and that he, the writer, did not follow, and that he does not know why he did not follow, except that he understood in that moment that the thing wanted to be followed. 3 men. 1 night. Out through a door that opened from the inside, onto a shelf where the wind was running at a speed that kills an unprotected man in minutes, walking away from the only warmth for 100 miles toward the thing that had learned their attention and, having learned it, had begun to call it back. The relief ship was late. It always is in these accounts. That is part of the quiet arithmetic of how such things get lost. When its party reached the structure, they found the outer seal fastened, and it was fastened from within, the pins driven home on the inside face, the door immovable, so that they had to break it. And I want you to hold that in your mind, because a laboratory sealed from the inside is a laboratory in which the last living occupant chose to keep something out or to keep something in, and either way chose to be locked in the dark with it. Inside, the lamps were dead, and the stove was cold, and the tank was empty. Not broken, not overturned. The glass was whole, the frame was sound, the brine was gone as though it had never been poured, and the coiled, translucent body that 11 days of notes had described in loving, terrified detail was simply not there. There was one man alive. He was sitting against the far wall, out of reach of the tank, facing it, and he had been facing it long enough that the relief party's own account, the one document in this whole affair that sits in an archive under a catalogue number I will give you before the end, records that he would not turn his head toward them when they entered, would not answer to his name, would not, in the days it took to carry him back to the ship and the weeks it took to bring him home, say a single word about what he had seen. He never did. He lived years more and he never spoke of it, and the men who tended him wrote that he could not bear to be looked at, that he flinched from a direct gaze the way a burned man flinches from heat, and I think you understand now why, because he had watched the thing longest and he had lived, and something in him had learned the same lesson the creature had taught the brine and the glass and the 3 men on the ice. It prefers to be seen. And he had spent his last strength refusing, for the rest of his life, to see or be seen. But it is the sealing that I keep returning to. Because when the relief party lifted their lamps in that emptied chamber, in the frost that had crept over every surface in the long cold after the stove died, they found on the ceiling directly above the place where the tank had hung its suspended cargo an outline, a shape rendered in frost, sharper than the frost around it, a clean, coiled figure ringed and limbed exactly as the notebooks had drawn the animal, printed on the underside of the ice roof as though the thing had risen from the tank and pressed itself, its whole translucent segmented length, flat against the ceiling, and stayed there long enough to leave its portrait in the cold. Hanging above them, facing down, in the last place a man lying on his back against the far wall would have been forced to look. Now I have to be fair to you, because I have spent long enough with this material that I owe you the version of it that requires nothing strange at all, and I want you to feel its weight before I take it away. There is a man in the literature, a marine biologist, sober, well-sighted, no interest in the paranormal, who has read the notebook transcriptions and told me, kindly, that I was describing a decomposing worm. Specifically a giant nematine, a ribbon worm, of the kind that reaches lengths no aquarium visitor would believe, 30, 40, in one recorded case near 50 feet of soft segmented body that in life is banded and translucent, and in death does exactly what the notebooks describe. It swells, its tissues, breaking down, release gas and fluid that make the whole mass shift and settle and appear, to a frightened man by lamplight, to move on its own. The pulsing is decomposition. The turning toward whichever man watched it longest is a coil of rotting tissue slowly slumping under its own softening weight, and the man who happened to be watching read intention into gravity, the way we all read faces into clouds. Ribbon worms are ribbed. They are limbed in the sense that their proboscis and lateral folds can splay into shapes that no field guide of 1908 would have let a sledging party name. And the deaths, the 3 men who walked out onto the ice in a single night, that is the oldest killer in the polar record, not a creature, but a stove. A fouled burner, a blocked flue, carbon monoxide pooling in a sealed ice chamber through a long, dark night, and carbon monoxide does not simply kill. First, it deranges. It brings euphoria, confusion, the conviction that you are too hot when you are freezing, the irresistible urge to go outside and cool down, and it has emptied more than one polar hut of men who walked calmly to their deaths in the open, convinced they were doing something sensible. The survivor lived because he lay against the far wall where a draft reached him. His silence was hypoxic brain injury, not horror. The frost on the ceiling was frost. The stain of the outline was the ghost of a warmer object that had hung there and shed its heat upward, a perfectly ordinary thermal shadow printed in ice. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it genuinely persuasive, that on the days when I have not slept, I reach for it, and it holds, that it explains the pulse and the turning and the wandering and the silence, and even, at a stretch, the portrait in the frost, and that a careful man is supposed to stop here, close the folder, and file the whole thing under the long human history of frightened people in the dark. And I almost did. But the explanation explains 1908. It does not explain 1947. Because the tank was empty when the relief party sealed the chamber and carried the survivor away. Empty, I want to be precise. The glass reported clear, and the brine gone or frozen to a rind at the bottom. And that is where the story sits for 39 years, until a survey team, I will give you the operation and the year, and you can pull the records yourself, because I did, comes ashore on Rothschild Island in the austral summer of 1947, works its way inland to a structure marked on no chart, cuts into a chamber that their own log calls sealed from within, and files, in a hand that grows shorter and flatter as the entry goes on, that the tank in the inner room was full. Not iced over, full, occupied. A body suspended in fluid that had no business being liquid at that temperature, coiled, ringed, translucent, exactly and impossibly as the 1908 notebooks had drawn the thing that was gone. And here is the detail I cannot walk past, the one that keeps me at this desk. The 1947 team logged the sighting, marked the position, and left to complete their survey line with the stated intention of returning to document it properly. They did not return. Weather, the record says. Reassignment. The season closed. The relevant men rotated home. And no expedition since has been sent to that structure to confirm or deny what a decomposing worm from 1908 was doing back in its tank, whole, 4 decades after it was carried out onto the ice inside the bodies of 3 men, because a worm that rots does not unrot, a tank that empties does not refill itself with a preserved specimen, and there is no ribbon worm and no fouled stove and no carbon monoxide in the world that puts the thing back. So the skeptics are right about the deaths, and I believe them, and they are right that the pulse was decay, and the turning was gravity, and the survivor's silence was a wound in his brain, and none of it touches the only question that was ever really the question. If it was found once, thawing, cut from deep shelf ice on an island that no registry admits was visited by an expedition that no registry admits sailed, and if it was gone from its tank and printed on the ceiling and gone from the world, and if it was then, 39 years later, back in the tank, full, waiting, seen by men who meant to come back and never did, then I'm not asking what it was. I have given up asking what it was. I am asking what it is doing now, right now. On an island most of you had never heard of before this hour, in a chamber sealed from the inside, above a floor where the frost still holds the shape of 3 men's boots walking toward a door, in a tank of brine that will not freeze, there may be a coiled, translucent length that has learned to prefer being seen and has waited, patient as ice, through every decade in which no one came to look. It was found thawing once, and the men who found it are gone, and the men who found it again are gone, and the record has thinned to a catalogue number and a survey line abandoned mid-sentence, and the tank, as far as anyone alive can honestly tell you, has never once been reported empty again. I have gone back to the material more times than I can defend, and every time I return to the same place. Not the deaths, not the worm, not the stove. I return to the frost on the ceiling, because that is the one thing in this entire record that no ordinary explanation has ever been able to lift off. A decomposing animal does not leave a portrait of itself in ice, hanging over an empty hook, 3 feet from where it was suspended. A hallucination does not etch a segmented outline into the underside of a sealed roof and hold it there long enough for a relief crew to photograph it, though the photograph, of course, is one of the things no registry admits exists. Let me tell you what I actually know, stripped of everything I want to be true. I know there is a field notebook whose ink has been dated by the one lab that ever handled it to a manufacture no later than 1910. I know it describes an island by a bearing that resolves to Rothschild, off the west coast of the peninsula, in a year when the official maps still left half of that coastline as a guess. I know it uses the word thawing and the word turning, and the phrase would not stop facing the lamp, in a hand that grows less steady with every page until the last 3 entries are barely more than pressure marks in the paper. And I know that in 1947 a survey line, logged and initialed and then abandoned without explanation, records a sealed structure on that same island and a tank inside it, and beside the tank a single word that the transcribers rendered with a question mark of their own as occupied. That is the whole of the hard record. Everything else, the crew rosters that were never filed, the expedition that sailed under no flag anyone will name, the survivor who lived another 30 years in an institution near Dundee and spoke, when he spoke at all, only to say that it was warm. Everything else is texture. It is the dread around the thing. And I have spent enough of my life inside that dread to tell you honestly that it proves nothing. A man can go mad in the cold and say warm for the rest of his days. A survey team can write occupied and mean nothing more than that ice had reformed in the glass. I concede all of it. I have to. The moment I stop conceding it, I stop being a person you should listen to. But here is what the conceding does not reach. Every ordinary explanation I have been handed explains a piece and then stops at the edge of the next piece, as though it has hit a wall. The stove explains the deaths and says nothing about the empty tank. The worm explains the shape in the brine and says nothing about the frost on the ceiling. The mirage explains the turning and says nothing about the tank being full again in 1947. String them all together, and you still have a gap in the middle exactly the size and shape of the thing itself, a hole in the account precisely where the creature should be. And every skeptic I respect has walked right up to that hole and named it something else and walked away. I do not blame them. I have wanted to walk away from it for years, so I will do the only honest thing left, which is to stand where those men stood and describe what is there now, as far as anyone can say there is anything there at all. The chamber is still on the island. Structures like that do not blow away. The ice takes them and keeps them, and Rothschild Island is not a place people go. It is off every route that matters. It has no station, no cache, no reason. Whatever was sealed from the inside in 1908 was sealed by hands that are long gone, and whatever a 1947 survey team saw through the glass before they turned back and vanished from their own paperwork is, by the plain arithmetic of who has been there since, still exactly where they left it. No one has reported the tank empty. No one has reported it at all. The last human sentence ever written about that room ends mid-line, and after that there is only weather. I told you at the start that I would open on the moment a man first stood in front of it, and I want to end there, because the ring closes whether I want it to or not. Picture the lamplight again. Picture it falling across brine that will not freeze, and the coiled, translucent length inside, ribbed like a diatom and limbed like nothing in any catalogue, its surface pulsing so faintly that you tell yourself it is your own pulse in your own eyes. Picture the men leaning in, one by one, and the thing turning, slowly, toward whichever of them held the gaze longest, as if being looked at were the one thing in 11 days of thawing that it had been waiting for. Now hold that image and let the decades run over it. The men who saw it that night walked out onto the ice and never came back. The men who saw it 39 years later drove a survey line to the door, wrote one word, and never came back. And the room went quiet, and the frost kept the shape of boots walking away, and the tank, by every honest account, stayed full. I am not asking what it was anymore. I gave that up somewhere in the 3rd week, the night I understood that whatever answer I found would only be a name laid over the whole, another word like worm or mirage or delirium, comforting and exactly the wrong size. What was it? The question sounds like the important one, and it is not. It is the question you ask when you still believe the thing is finished, filed, over, a specimen that lived once and rotted once and belongs to the past. But the past is where things stay still, and this thing did not stay still. It was cut from ice that had held it who knows how long. It thawed, and it turned, and it emptied its tank into 3 men and printed itself on the roof and vanished, and then it was back, whole, coiled, waiting, seen and left, and never disturbed again. That is not the record of something that ended. That is the record of something that pauses. So I will leave you where I have been unable to leave myself, on an island most of you had never heard of an hour ago, above a floor of frozen boot prints leading to a door that opens from neither side without hands, in a chamber no one has entered in the lifetime of anyone now breathing, where a tank of brine that does not freeze holds, as far as the world can honestly tell you, exactly what it held when the last man who saw it turned and walked away and did not look back. It was found thawing once. It was found again, and then it was left alone, and it has been alone a very long time, in the dark, patient as ice, in a place that learned to prefer being seen. And the only question I have left, the one I cannot put down, the one this whole record has been circling since the first fall of lamplight on that faintly pulsing coil, is not what it was. It is what it is doing now.